Joining us on the line is Trevor McCrisken, Associate Professor of American Politics at the University of Warwick. Thanks for being with us here on LBC News this morning. You have stayed up to watch the debate. What did you take away from it?
Well, the first thing was it was a much calmer affair, wasn't it, than we saw the last time that these two got on a stage together. Far more serious and more focused. We actually had a discussion of policy. Some policy positions were stated. I think particularly from Biden, we had a lot more detail than he was able to give the last time around, because he wasn't being interrupted as much as before. And I think also that the time that he took before this debate to prepare really did come through, that he had a lot of sort of positions that he was ready to give on the various issues that were raised, COVID-19 and the recovery from that, as we've just heard, but also on healthcare, more generally going forwards, looking at immigration policies towards racial justice and climate change. There was a lot of detail that Biden was able to go into. Trump, on the other hand, was far more disciplined than we saw previously, and indeed than he has been in recent days in TV interviews, for example, but still occasionally diverting from the questions that were asked to focus on issues that he would rather bring up. When we got into national security, for example, there wasn't too much on actual national security and more on these unsubstantiated claims that he's making about Biden and his son Hunter's sort of connections to Russia, Ukraine, China, etc. But I think Trump was trying through most of the debate to give more kind of careful and calmer answers to the questions in a way that I think was probably designed much more for the sort of moderate Republican voters rather than his core base who rather like the attack dog approach. But we really didn't see very much of that tonight from Trump.
In the previous debates, the moderator didn't really get too involved in the business of fact-checking and interrupting. Did we see much more of that tonight? I don't think we did.
Maybe a little bit more. I mean, I think there were at least a few times when the moderator did stick to her guns in terms of the questions that she was trying to ask and trying to make sure she got an answer to those questions. There was at one point she repeated a question 3 times to Donald Trump because she wasn't getting a direct answer, and then turned to Biden and asked the same question. This was to do with immigration and this question of what was going to happen to these children that have been separated from their parents when they came across the border and now can't be reunited because the records weren't kept as to exactly who their parents were and where they were taken to. And so she did at least try to keep the flow going and occasionally would challenge, I think, both candidates on positions that they were stating, looking back through Biden's record example to some of the decisions that or some of the votes that he'd taken when he was a member of the Congress. So I think there was a bit more of that happening tonight, and maybe more possibility to, simply because it was more disciplined. And I think that there was certainly a lot of response in the coverage that I was sort of watching on Twitter. People were suggesting that she'd done a much better job, certainly than Chris Wallace had in that first debate. But then again, that was such a sort of torrid affair that I don't think anyone would have been able to control the sort of debate that night. So in a lot of ways, I think the way that both candidates came to this tonight made it a much better debate and enabled the moderator to actually moderate, and get through most of the questions that she wanted to ask.
Do you think that this will have helped voters to actually come to a decision about who they want to vote for? Bear in mind, of course, that there has been an awful lot of people who've already voted because of the circumstances of the election this time around.
Yeah, well, 47 million people, probably more than that now, are not in a position to have their minds changed because, as you say, they have already voted, and that's an extraordinary number ahead of the election, and still with more than a week to go until the election itself to have voted. So I think really, as is often the case with the final presidential debate, it's really those few people, relatively few people, who haven't yet decided, and we think that's probably in the region of about 10% of voters sort of going into this final part of the election period were undecided as to which way to vote. So they would have had more opportunity tonight to get to a bit more of the detail of what the differences are between the positions being taken on this range of issues that were tackled tonight. And it might enable some of those individuals to make decisions based on what they've seen and heard from the two candidates tonight that could tip them one way or the other. But no, I think the majority of people that were watching the debate, it will simply reinforce the positions that they already had. If they're Trump supporters, they will think that he did terribly well tonight and demonstrated that he is a decent president, that he can sort of control his temper, and that he does have some insights to give on the issues that were being debated. On the other side of it, Biden, did a nice job of keeping his sort of positions flowing and giving a lot of detail that will have impressed his supporters as well. What I think both candidates are really trying to do in these last few days is not just get those wavering voters to decide one way or the other, but also anyone who is really concerned perhaps about going out to vote in the current climate, to encourage them to cast that vote, to make it worth their while to leave their homes and go to the polling booth, whether that's in advance of election day or on election day itself. Then it's all about motivating their voters to actually get out there and vote for them. And as I said, I think on Trump's side this time, I think that first debate was really aimed at his core voters, his kind of what we call the base of his voters, who really like him to be very aggressive and not giving any ground. Tonight, I think was more measured from Trump, and therefore perhaps would be more attractive to those moderate Republicans who maybe voted for him in 2016 through gritted teeth, particularly want Hillary Clinton to be president, so they voted for Trump. Though after 4 years of him in office, they were perhaps less enamored with the idea of him returning for another 4 years. They might have had some of their doubts kind of eased a little by the way that he was tonight.
Well, Trevor McCrisken, Associate Professor of American Politics at the University of Warwick, thank you very much for being with us here on LBC News this morning. We are bringing you reaction and analysis to the final US presidential debate, which has been taking place in Nashville, Tennessee. Much more on the way, and we'll get the travel and the weather next.
This is LBC News.